The paper trembled in my hands, a simple, yellowed sheet of legal stationery that felt heavier than the entire world. The fluorescent lights of the bank's private viewing room hummed with a sickening, sterile buzz, casting long shadows against the steel walls of the vault. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thin, recycled, devoid of the warmth I desperately needed. My eyes, red-rimmed and burning, scanned the typed letters for the 10th time, hoping they would rearrange themselves into something that made sense, something that didn't shatter the foundation of my 26 years of existence. But the ink remained stubborn, permanent, and cruel. Inside the safety deposit box, nestled on top of a stack of bonds, was my birth certificate, but it wasn't right. Under the section strictly labeled Father, the name wasn't Richard Sterling, the man who had raised me with a cold iron fist, the man who was currently downstairs waiting in the car, checking his Rolex with impatience. The name was different, and under child's name, it didn't say Lucia Sterling. It said Lucia Valentina Rossi. 2 different names. 2 different lives. I had been living a lie. My knees gave way, and I slid down the cold metal cabinets until I hit the industrial carpet, clutching the paper against my chest as a guttural sob ripped through my throat. I felt like a porcelain doll that had been dropped from a great height, shattered, with pieces of my identity scattering across the floor where I couldn't reach them. How could she? How could my mother, the only person who had ever looked at me with genuine love, keep this from me? And worse, how could she leave me alone with him, the man I now knew was a stranger, a fraud who had treated us both like inconvenient furniture in his grand empty mansion? But wait, I am getting ahead of myself. My hands are shaking so badly I can barely hold the pen, but I need to tell you how I ended up on the floor of a bank vault, mourning a mother I thought I knew, and fearing a father who turns out to be a ghost. To understand the horror of this moment, the absolute betrayal that tastes like ash in my mouth, let me take you back to where this nightmare began. Just 3 days ago, to the attic. It had been raining for a week straight, a relentless gray drizzle that matched the color of my grief. We had buried my mother, Elena, only 7 days prior. The cancer had been quick, a thief in the night that stole her warmth and left behind a pale, fragile shell. The house, a sprawling Victorian estate that always felt too big and too cold, now felt like a tomb. Richard, I can't bring myself to call him Dad right now, had barely shed a tear at the funeral. He had stood by the grave in his immaculate black Italian suit, looking more concerned about the mud splashing on his shoes than the fact that his wife of 27 years was being lowered into the ground. That morning, the morning I found it, the house was suffocatingly quiet. Richard had left early for the firm, leaving me with a list of instructions on the kitchen counter. Clean out the attic, sort her things, donates the clothes. We list the house next month. His handwriting was sharp, jagged, devoid of emotion. He wanted to erase her. He wanted to scrub Elena Sterling from the walls so he could sell the asset and move on to his next investment. The injustice of it made my blood boil. She wasn't even cold in the ground, and he was already liquidating her memory. I climbed the narrow, creaking stairs to the attic, clutching a mug of tea that had long gone cold. The air up there was thick with dust and the scent of cedar, but underneath it all, I could smell her, lavender and old paper. It was a smell that usually brought me comfort, wrapping around me like one of her knitted shawls. But today, it just made the hollow ache in my chest expand. The attic was a labyrinth of shadows and forgotten things. Old furniture, covered in white sheets, looked like ghosts standing in judgment. I started with the trunks near the window, where the rain tapped a rhythmic, sorrowful beat against the glass. I opened a heavy oak chest, expecting to find old curtains or linens. Instead, I found her life. There were dresses I remembered her wearing when I was a child, soft floral prints that smelled of sunlight, contrasting sharply with the stiff gray suits Richard forced her to wear to his corporate dinners. I held a blue silk scarf to my face, inhaling deeply, letting the tears flow freely. I missed her so much, it felt physical, a sharp pain beneath my ribs. I was 26 years old, technically an adult, but in that dim attic, I felt like a lost child waiting for her mother to come home and turn on the lights. I reached for a stack of old books at the bottom of the trunk, intending to move them to the donate pile, when something slipped out from between a copy of Great Expectations and an old cookbook. It was a book I had never seen before. Bound in worn burgundy leather, the edges frayed from use, it looked ancient and secretive. There was no title on the spine. I sat back on my heels, wiping the dust from the cover. My heart did a strange little flip, a premonition perhaps. I opened it. "Property of Elena," it said on the first page in her elegant, looping handwriting. But the ink was different, older, faded to a sepia tone. It was a diary. I shouldn't read it. That was my first thought. It felt like an invasion of privacy, a violation of the one boundary she had left. But Richard's voice echoed in my head, telling me to sort her things. And I was desperate for a piece of her, a conversation, anything to break the silence of death. So I turned the page. The entries were sporadic at first. Recipes, observations about the garden, complaints about the rainy English weather. But as I flipped through the years, the tone changed. The writing became jagged, hurried. There were tear stains warping the paper in places. She wrote about loneliness. She wrote about a cage gilded in gold. She wrote about Richard's coldness, his obsession with image, his dismissal of her dreams. "He looks at me, but he doesn't see me," an entry from 1998 read. "He only sees the wife of the CEO. I am an accessory." I read for hours, losing track of time as the light in the attic shifted from gray to a deep, bruising purple. My legs were numb, but I couldn't stop. I was seeing a side of my mother I had only sensed but never confirmed. A woman full of passion and fire, slowly suffocated by a loveless marriage. Then I reached the end. The last few pages were written recently. The handwriting was shaky, the strokes weak, likely written when the sickness had already taken hold of her hands. "My dearest Lucia," the entry began. My breath hitched. She was speaking to me. "If you are reading this, I am gone, and I am so sorry I left you alone with him. I was a coward." I wiped my eyes, trying to focus on the dancing letters. "There is a secret I have carried for 26 years. It has eaten me alive, rot from the inside out, worse than this cancer. You deserve to know." My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of warning. "I'm 26 years old," I whispered to the empty room, repeating the age she referenced, the age I was now. I turned the page. The next words were written in bold, frantic strokes, the pen digging deep into the paper. "Your father isn't who you think. I'm so sorry." The world seemed to stop spinning. The silence of the attic roared in my ears. "Your father isn't who you think." Frantically, my fingers fumbling and clumsy, I flipped back through the diary, counting the pages. 45, 46, 47. There, Taped to the page with a piece of yellowing Scotch tape was a small, silver key. It was flat and unremarkable, the kind you would lose in a drawer and never think about again. But to me, it looked like a weapon. I ripped it off the page, tearing the paper slightly. I didn't care. I needed to know. I needed to understand why my mother, the gentlest soul I knew, would leave such a grenade in her final words. I didn't wait for Richard to come home. I didn't wait for the rain to stop. I grabbed my coat, shoved the diary and the key into my purse, and ran down the stairs, past the portraits of Richard's ancestors who glared at me with disdain, and out into the storm. Driving to the bank was a blur. I remember the windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge, the tires splashing through puddles that looked like black oil. My mind was racing, conjuring up wild scenarios. Was I adopted? Was Richard my stepfather? But no, I had his eyes, or so everyone said. You have the sterling eyes, they would tell me at galas. But looking back, maybe they were just projecting. Maybe I had simply learned to mimic his cold stare to survive in his house. The bank manager, Mr. Henderson, looked surprised to see me. "Miss Sterling," he said, adjusting his glasses, "we weren't expecting you." "He's not here," I cut him off, my voice sounding strange and tinny to my own ears. "I need to access my mother's personal box." Mr. Henderson hesitated, glancing at the clock. "Of course, but usually, Mr. It's my mother's box," I said, leaning over his desk, channeling a strength I didn't know I possessed, "and I have the key." He must have seen the desperation in my eyes, or perhaps the ghost of my mother's suffering, because he nodded slowly and led me down the long, silent corridor. The vault was heavy, impenetrable. The air inside was climate-controlled and still. He left me in the private room with the long metal box, bowing slightly before closing the door. For a long moment, I just stared at the box. It was gray metal, number 402. I held the key in my hand. It was warm now, heated by my anxious grip. If I opened this, there was no going back. If I opened this, the world as I knew it, the privileged, lonely, quiet life of Lucia Sterling would cease to exist. But I had to know. For her. For Elena. I inserted the key. It turned with a smooth, satisfying click. I lifted the lid. Inside, there was no jewelry, no stacks of cash, just a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon and a single official-looking document folded in half. I reached for the document first. My fingers brushed the paper, and a shiver went down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I unfolded it. And that brings us back to now. To me, crumpled on the floor, staring at the name Lucia Valentina Rossi. Who is Rossi? The name sounds Italian, warm, passionate, everything the name Sterling is not. I forced myself to look at the document again. Date of birth, October 14th. Place of birth, a small hospital in Tuscany, Italy. Italy? I had never been to Italy. Richard hated travel unless it was for business in London or New York. But my mother, she always spoke of Italy with a strange, wistful longing. I had been born in another life. I reached into the box again, my hand trembling violently, and pulled out the bundle of letters. The ribbon came undone easily, as if it had been waiting years to be released. I picked up the top envelope. It was addressed to Elena in a bold, artistic script that looked nothing like Richard's jagged scrawl. I pulled out the letter. It was dated 26 years ago. "My beloved Elena," it began, "I know you must go back. I know your family forces this union with Sterling for the money, for the debt your father owes. But do not forget the olive groves. Do not forget the fireflies. And do not forget that the life growing inside you is made of love, not business. I will wait for you, even if it takes a lifetime. Matteo. The name hit me like a physical blow. Matteo Rossi. My father. I wasn't a sterling. I wasn't the heir to a cold empire of stocks and bonds. I was the daughter of a man named Matteo who wrote about olive groves and fireflies. I was the product of a love affair that had been sacrificed to pay a grandfather's debt. A wave of nausea washed over me. Richard knew. He had to know. The way he looked at me with that distant, calculating appraisal, it wasn't just that he was a cold man, it was that he was looking at another man's child. He had raised me not out of love, but out of what? Obligation? A contract? To keep up appearances? Suddenly, a memory flashed in my mind. I was 7 years old, falling off my bicycle in the driveway. I had scraped my knee, blood trickling down my leg. Richard had been standing on the porch. He hadn't rushed to me. He hadn't picked me up. He had simply watched, sipping his scotch, and said, "Stop crying, Lucia." But I wasn't a sterling. Anger, hot and righteous, began to replace the shock. They had stolen my life. Richard, with his money and his power, had bought my mother and claimed me as property. And my mother, oh, Mom, she had stayed. She had endured 26 years of his icy tyranny to protect me? Or was she trapped, threatened? I looked at the birth certificate again. Lucia Valentina Rossi. I stood up. My legs were shaky, but I locked my knees. I wiped the tears from my face with the back of my hand. The fluorescent lights didn't seem so harsh anymore. They seemed like spotlights on a stage where the curtain had finally risen. I folded the birth certificate and placed it carefully in my purse, alongside the diary. I took the letters, every single one of them. I wasn't leaving anything behind. I walked out of the viewing room. "Mister, what is it?" he asked. I stopped. I looked at him, really looked at him, and then at my reflection in the glass partition behind him. I looked pale, my dark hair messy, my eyes swollen. But there was a fire in them now, a fire that belonged to a man named Matteo. "No," I said, my voice steady, lower than usual. Mr. Henderson looked confused. "Nothing," I said, clutching my purse tighter. I walked out of the bank and into the rain. The water soaked me instantly, plastering my clothes to my skin, but I didn't care. It felt cleansing. It felt like baptism. I got into my car, a sensible sedan that Richard had chosen for me, safe and reliable, he had said. I sat there for a moment, the engine idling, the windshield wipers slapping back and forth. I had a choice. I could go back to the mansion. I could pretend I never saw this. I could continue to be the dutiful daughter, inherit the fortune, marry a man Richard approved of, and slowly wither away just like my mother did. Or I looked at the passenger seat where the diary and the letters lay. I could find him. I could find Matteo Rossi. But first, I had to go home. I had to face Richard. Not as his daughter, but as the woman who knew his secret. He was expecting me for dinner at 7 sharp. He hated lateness. I put the car in gear. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The sadness was still there, a heavy stone in my gut, but it was being pushed aside by a burning need for answers. And for the first time in my life, a need for vengeance. He had stolen my mother's happiness. He had stolen my identity. He wasn't going to get away with it. I drove through the iron gates of the Sterling estate, the house looming ahead like a dark fortress. The lights were on in the dining room. He was waiting. I touched the diary in my bag one last time for courage. The truth is in the safety deposit box. I had the truth now, and it was going to burn this house to the ground. The heavy oak door of the manor groaned as I pushed it open, a sound that used to signal safety, but now sounded like the closing of a prison cell. My wet shoes squeaked against the polished marble of the foyer, a sharp, intrusive noise in the mausoleum-like silence of the house. Mrs. Gable, our housekeeper for as long as I could remember, hurried out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her kind, wrinkled face fell when she saw me. I was dripping wet, my hair plastered to my skull, my eyes wild and red-rimmed, clutching my purse to my chest as if it contained the crown jewels. "Oh, Miss Lucia," she whispered, reaching out to take my soaked coat. "You'll catch your death. Look at you, you're shivering. Let me get you a hot towel." I stepped back, shaking my head. The movement sent a spray of rainwater onto the pristine floor. Richard would hate that. The thought gave me a grim, twisted satisfaction. "No, Mrs. Gable. I'm fine. Is he in the dining room?" She nodded, her eyes darting nervously toward the double doors. "He's been waiting. The soup is already served. He's in a mood, miss." He was always in a mood of perpetual dissatisfaction. I walked past her, ignoring the puddle forming around my feet. I could feel the diary and the letters burning through the leather of my bag, pressing against my side like a hot iron. I wasn't just walking into dinner. I was walking into a war zone, and for the first time in my life, I was armed. I didn't knock. I pushed the dining room doors open with both hands. The room was cavernous, lit by the crystal chandelier that Richard insisted be fully illuminated, even for a simple Tuesday dinner. The table was long enough to seat 20, but it was set for 2, at opposite ends, a physical manifestation of the emotional ocean between us. Richard sat at the head, his back straight, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, a spoon suspended halfway to his mouth. He didn't look up immediately. He finished his sip of soup, placed the spoon down with a deliberate, soft clink, and then, only then, did he raise his eyes to me. "You are 11 minutes late, Lucia," he said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and devoid of any warmth. It was the voice he used to fire employees or negotiate hostile takeovers. And look at you. You look like a drowned rat. Go upstairs and change. We will wait for the main course. I didn't move. I didn't apologize. I stood at the threshold, breathing hard, the smell of rain and ozone clinging to me, clashing with the scent of expensive truffle oil wafting from his bowl. I said, "Go change," he repeated, picking up his wine glass. He swirled the red liquid, bored. "I'm not hungry," I said. My voice trembled, but not with fear, with rage. A pure, white-hot rage that started in my toes and worked its way up to my throat. Richard sighed, a sound of immense suffering, as if my lack of appetite was a personal affront to his dignity. "Sit down, then. Stop dripping on the Persian rug. It's worth more than your car." I walked to the table, but I didn't go to my usual seat at the far end. I walked right up to him, my wet sneakers squelching on the expensive wool. I pulled the chair out to his right, my mother's chair, and sat down. The wood felt cold. The cushion still held the ghost of her shape, or maybe I was just imagining it, desperate for her support. Richard stopped eating. He turned his head slowly to look at me, his blue eyes narrowing. "That is Elena's chair." "Elena is dead," I snapped. The words hung in the air, brutal and necessary. His jaw tightened. A small muscle ticked in his cheek. I am aware. That does not give you permission to disrespect her place at this table. Move." I didn't move. Instead, I reached into my purse. My fingers brushed the soft leather of the diary, the crisp edges of the letters, but I bypassed them. I grabbed the folded document, the birth certificate. I pulled it out and slammed it onto the table, right next to his bread plate. It landed with a slap that echoed off the high ceilings. "What is this?" he asked, looking at the paper with distaste, as if it were a dirty napkin. "Read it," I whispered. "I have no patience for your dramatics tonight, Lucia. The funeral was a week ago. Grief is natural, but hysteria is unbecoming." "Read it!" I screamed. The sound tore from my throat, raw and ugly. Richard flinched. It was the first time in 26 years I had ever raised my voice at him. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for a second I saw something flicker behind his icy mask. Was it fear? Caution? He set down his napkin and picked up the paper. He unfolded it slowly, his manicured fingers precise. He took a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket and slid them onto his nose. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Tick, tock, tick, tock, counting down the seconds of his lie. He read it. I watched his eyes scan the lines. I watched for a reaction. Shock, guilt, sorrow. But there was nothing. His face remained a mask of stone. He finished reading, folded the paper back up along its original creases, and placed it on the table. He took off his glasses. "So," he said, his voice flat, "you went digging." "That's it?" I choked out, tears stinging my eyes again. "That's all you have to say?" "I'm 26 years old, Richard. I have spent my entire life trying to please you, trying to be the perfect daughter for the great Richard Sterling. I studied business because you wanted me to. I wore the clothes you picked. I suppressed every artistic bone in my body because you said art was for the weak. And all this time, you weren't even my father." He picked up his wine glass and took a sip. "I am your father, Lucia. I am the one who paid for the braces on your teeth. I am the one who paid for your private schools. I am the one who put a roof over your head and clothes on your back. Biology is a messy, irrelevant detail." "A detail?" I stood up, my hands gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. "My name is Lucia Valentina Rossi. Who is he? Who is Matteo?" Richard let out a short, derisive laugh. It was a cruel sound. Matteo. He was a peasant, a dirt-poor farmer with mud under his fingernails and poetry in his empty head. He seduced your mother with cheap words and fireflies because he had nothing else to offer her. "He loved her," I yelled, defending the man I had never met, the man whose letters were burning a hole in my bag. "He loved her, and she loved him." "Love doesn't pay the bills, Lucia." Richard slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. His composure finally cracked, revealing the ugly arrogance underneath. "Your grandfather was a fool. He gambled away the family fortune. He owed me millions. He was going to prison. I made him a deal. I cleared his debts. I saved their family reputation. And in exchange, I took Elena." I stared at him, horror washing over me like ice water. You bought her? Like a piece of land? Like a horse?" "I provided for her," he roared, standing up to his full height. He loomed over me, imposing and terrifying, but I didn't shrink back. Not this time. She was pregnant with another man's bastard. A scandal like that would have destroyed her family in their conservative little Italian village. I took damaged goods, and I gave her a life of luxury. I gave her this house. I gave her the sterling name. And I gave you a legitimate life. Do you think you would be standing here today wearing silk and driving a Mercedes if you had grown up on a goat farm in Tuscany? I looked around the opulent dining room, at the velvet curtains and the gold-leafed mirrors. It all looked like rot to me now. It looked like ashes. I would rather have starved, I said, my voice shaking with the weight of the truth. I would rather have grown up in a shack with a father who actually looked at me with love than in this palace with a monster who looks at me like an investment. You are an ungrateful child, he spat, just like your mother. She spent 27 years weeping silently in her room, listening to her sad Italian opera, mourning a life that never existed. She was weak, and I see her weakness in you. Don't you dare talk about her, I hissed. You killed her. Maybe not with a gun, but you killed her spirit. You suffocated her slowly, day by day, with your coldness. And you tried to do the same to me. I did what was necessary. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, regaining his composure. Now sit down, finish your dinner, we will burn that piece of paper, and we will never speak of this again. You are a sterling. You are my heir. That is the only truth that matters in the real world. I looked at the birth certificate on the table. Then I looked at him. For the first time, I saw him not as the powerful patriarch, but as a sad, small man, surrounded by things he had bought but could not feel. No, I said softly. Excuse me? No. I reached out and took the birth certificate. I folded it carefully and put it back in my purse. I am not a sterling, and I am not hungry. I turned around and started walking toward the door. If you walk out that door, Lucia, Richard's voice was low and dangerous, do not expect to come back. I will cut you off. You won't see a dime. No trust fund, no inheritance, nothing. You will be on the street. I stopped at the doorway. I thought about the millions of dollars waiting for me. I thought about the security, the ease of life I was throwing away. And then I thought about the olive groves. I thought about the man named Matteo who had waited 26 years. I thought about my mother's diary and the key taped to page 47. I turned to look at him one last time. Keep your money, Richard. It's the only thing you have. I walked out into the foyer. Mrs. Gable was standing there, wringing her hands, tears streaming down her face. She had heard everything. "Oh, honey," she sobbed, reaching for me. "What will you do? Where will you go?" I hugged her, holding on to the only warmth I had known in this house besides my mother. I pulled back and wiped her tears, realizing that my own face was wet, but I felt strangely light. "I'm going to find the truth, Mrs. Gable," I whispered. "I'm going to find my father." I grabbed my coat, but I didn't put it on. I opened the heavy front door and stepped back out into the storm. The rain hammered down on me, soaking my clothes instantly, but it didn't feel cold anymore. It felt like it was washing away the sterling grime. It felt like a baptism. I got into my car and threw my purse onto the passenger seat. I started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the long, winding driveway that led away from the estate. I didn't know where I was going to sleep tonight. I didn't know how I was going to get to Italy. I didn't know if Matteo Rossi was even alive. But as I pressed my foot onto the gas pedal and sped through the iron gates, leaving the vault of lies behind me, I knew one thing for certain. My name was Lucia Valentina Rossi, and my life was just beginning. The windshield wipers slashed back and forth. a hypnotic rhythm against the deluge, but they couldn't clear the blur in my vision. I wasn't just driving through a storm, I was driving through the wreckage of 25 years. Every mile that put distance between me and the iron gates of the Sterling estate felt like a layer of skin being peeled away. My hands, still gripping the leather steering wheel, were shaking so violently that the car drifted slightly to the left, the tires hydroplaning on the slick asphalt. I gasped, correcting the wheel, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had to pull over. I steered the sedan into the empty parking lot of a closed gas station, the neon sign buzzing and flickering overhead, casting a sickly green light onto the wet pavement. I killed the engine. The silence that followed wasn't silent at all. It was filled with the deafening roar of the rain on the metal roof and the jagged, gasping sounds of my own breathing. I looked at the passenger seat. The leather bag sat there, heavy with the weight of a stolen life. The letters, the diary, the birth certificate, Lucia Valentina Rossi. I said the name aloud, testing the shape of it on my tongue. It didn't feel like me, not yet. I looked down at my clothes, a silk blouse that cost more than a family's monthly rent, now ruined by rain, clinging to my skin like a second, cold layer. My shoes, Italian leather, soaked through. I was a sterling on the outside, a porcelain doll dressed in money, but inside, everything was shattering. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. The screen lit up, illuminating the dark cabin. Father. Father. The word made bile rise in my throat. I watched the screen glow, the name pulsing. He wasn't calling to apologize. Richard Sterling didn't apologize. He was calling to threaten, to negotiate, to manipulate. He was probably already calculating how to spin this story if I went to the press. Poor delusional daughter. Mental instability. We are getting her the best help. I picked up the phone. My thumb hovered over the decline button. Then, with a sudden surge of adrenaline, I rolled down the window. The rain lashed into the car, cold and biting. I threw the phone out into the darkness. It clattered against the concrete, and then silence. I rolled the window up, shivering. Now I was truly alone. No money, no contacts, no home. Richard would freeze my accounts by morning. I knew his efficiency too well. I had the cash in my wallet, maybe $200, and a half tank of gas. Where could I go? The friends I had were Sterling-approved friends, daughters of senators and CEOs who would dial Richard the moment I appeared at their doorsteps. I couldn't go to a hotel. They would ask for a credit card, and the card would lead him right to me. Then, a face floated up from the depths of my memory. A warm, round face smelling of yeast and lavender soap. Rosa. She had been our maid until I was 12. She was the one who braided my hair when my mother was too depressed to get out of bed. She was the one who smuggled cookies into my room when Richard put me on a strict diet because he thought my cheeks were too chubby. Richard had fired her for insubordination after he caught her hugging my mother while Elena wept in the kitchen. I hadn't seen her in 13 years, but I remembered where she lived. I remembered because once, just once, my mother had secretly driven us there to drop off a Christmas gift, terrified Richard would find out. 342 Elm Street, the house with the blue door. I put the car in gear. The engine whined as I merged back onto the highway, heading away from the manicured lawns of the wealthy district and toward the east side, where the streetlights were broken and the houses leaned against each other for support. The drive took 40 minutes. As the neighborhoods changed, so did the feeling in the pit of my stomach. The large oaks and wrought iron fences disappeared, replaced by chain link and cracked sidewalks. My luxury car felt like a target here, a gleaming silver beacon of the world I was fleeing. I found the street. It was narrow, lined with cars that looked like they hadn't moved in years. I crawled along, squinting at the house numbers. 338, 340, 342. The house was small, a bungalow with siding that had once been white but was now a tired gray. But the door was still bright, defiant blue. A single yellow light burned on the porch, a tiny lighthouse in the storm. I parked the car on the street, grabbed my purse, and stepped out. The rain had softened to a drizzle, but the wind cut through my wet clothes, biting at my bones. I walked up the cracked concrete path, my expensive heels catching on the uneven surface. I stood before the blue door, my fist raised to knock, and I hesitated. What if she didn't live here anymore? What if she didn't remember me? What if she hated me because I looked like him? I knocked. 3 sharp raps. I waited. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A curtain in the window to my right twitched. Then I heard the heavy slide of a deadbolt. The door opened a few inches, held by a safety chain. A pair of suspicious dark eyes peered out. She was older now, her hair completely white, lines of hardship etched deep around her mouth. She wore a faded floral housecoat. She asked, her voice raspy. My voice was a broken whisper. "It's me." The eyes widened. The door shut abruptly, and for a terrifying second, I thought she was locking me out. Then came the rattle of the chain being undone, and the door swung wide open. Rosa stood there, staring at me. She looked at my soaked clothes, my ruined hair, the wild desperation in my eyes. She didn't look at the expensive fabric. She looked at the trembling girl underneath. "Dios mío," she breathed, crossing herself. I didn't know where else to go," I stammered, tears mixing with the rain on my cheeks. I found out." The name acted like a physical blow. Rosa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She didn't ask questions. She didn't ask why a millionaire's daughter was standing on her porch looking like a drowned rat. She simply reached out, grabbed my arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong, and pulled me inside. "Come in, child." The house smelled of old wood, spices, and something incredibly comforting: warmth. It wasn't the sterile, climate-controlled warmth of the mansion. It was the heat of a radiator clanking in the corner, of life lived within small walls. Rosa bustled around me, muttering in Spanish. She stripped the wet coat off my shoulders, tsking at how cold my skin was. She guided me to a worn, velvet armchair that had seen better days, pushing me down into its soft embrace. "Sit." "Don't move," she commanded. She disappeared into the back and returned moments later with a thick wool blanket and a pair of oversized knitted socks. "Take off those ridiculous shoes," she said, pointing to my heels. I obeyed, my fingers numb as I fumbled with the straps. When I finally pulled the warm socks on and wrapped the scratchy wool blanket around me, I felt the first true sob escape my chest. It wasn't a scream like before. It was a deep, guttural release of tension. Rosa went to the small kitchen. I heard the whistle of a kettle. She came back with 2 mugs of tea, dark and steaming. She sat on the sofa opposite me, her knees almost touching mine. "Drink," she said gently. "It has honey and brandy." I took a sip. The liquid scalded my tongue, but the warmth bloomed in my chest, chasing away the icy chill of Richard's dining room. I cradled the mug with both hands, staring into the dark liquid. "You said you know about Mateo," Rosa said softly. It wasn't a question. I nodded, not trusting my voice. I reached into my purse, which I had placed on the floor, and pulled out the bundle of letters and the photo of the man in the olive grove. I handed them to her. Rosa took them as if they were holy relics. Her hands, calloused and spotted with age, trembled slightly as she touched the handwriting. She looked at the photo of Mateo, and her eyes filled with tears. "Mateo," she whispered, he was sunlight." I asked, leaning forward, hungry for every scrap of information. "I knew him," Rosa nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I was working for your grandfather in Italy that summer." She looked up at me, her eyes searching my face. "You have his chin, Lucia, and his fire. I always saw it, even when you were little, and—" "Richard said he was a peasant," I said bitterly. Rosa slammed her mug down on the coffee table, the sound startling me. "That man has a stone where his heart should be. Mateo was poor, yes, he worked the groves, but he was rich in ways Mr. Sterling will never understand. He brought Elena flowers, not from a florist, but wildflowers he picked himself from the hills. He sang to her. They would sit for hours under the stars just talking." "I never saw your mother smile like that," I whispered. Rosa sighed, a sound heavy with old regrets. "They tried. The night she found out she was pregnant with you, they planned to leave for Florence the next morning. But your grandfather, he was a weak man with dangerous debts. He had already promised Elena to Richard Sterling. The Sterlings wanted a connection to European nobility, even if the title was empty." She paused, looking away, her face twisting in pain. "He called Richard. He told him everything. And Richard, he didn't care about the baby. He cared about the possession. He arrived the next day with his lawyers and his security guards. They threatened Mateo. They told him if he ever came near Elena again, they would ensure he never worked in Italy again." My grip on the mug tightened until my knuckles turned white. "She fought," Rosa said fiercely. "Do not ever think she didn't fight. She screamed." She clung to the doorframe. "But they told her that if she went with Mateo, they would destroy him. They would ruin his life." "She sacrificed herself," I said, the realization settling heavy in my gut. "For me." "She died that day," Rosa said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The Elena I knew, she didn't get on that plane to America. Only her shell did." She reached out and took my hand. Her skin was rough, dry, and incredibly warm. "But you are here now." "I left him," I said, my voice gaining strength. "I left everything. The money, the house, the inheritance. He said I'd be on the street." Rosa smiled, a sad, crooked smile that lit up her face. "You are not nothing, Lucia Rossi. You are everything Elena wanted to be but couldn't." Free. The word hung in the air, mixing with the smell of the tea and the sound of the rain. I looked around the shabby living room. The wallpaper was peeling in the corner. The rug was threadbare. I had less in my pocket than I used to spend on a single lunch. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the crushing weight of expectation on my shoulders. I didn't feel the phantom eyes of ancestors judging my posture. "I need to find him," I said. Rosa squeezed my hand. "The last I heard, years ago, he never married. He stayed in Tuscany. He runs a small vineyard now, near San Gimignano." Elena's heart. The tears came again, hot and fast. He had named his vineyard after her. He had waited. "I'm going to Italy," I declared. It wasn't a wish anymore. It was a vow. "Good," Rosa nodded firmly. "But tonight you sleep." She stood up and went to a linen closet, pulling out a pillow and sheets. She made up the sofa for me, smoothing the wrinkles with care. "I don't have silk sheets," she apologized. "It's perfect," I said, and I meant it. As I laid down, the wool blanket scratching my chin, the exhaustion finally overtook the adrenaline. My body felt heavy, sinking into the lumpy cushions. I watched Rosa turn off the lamp, plunging the room into semi-darkness, illuminated only by the street lamp outside filtering through the thin curtains. I called out softly as she headed to her bedroom, "Sleep, Lucia." Home. She didn't mean the Sterling estate. She meant a place I had never been, a place with olive groves and fireflies. I closed my eyes. The image of Richard's angry purple face faded, replaced by the black and white photo of a man with laughing eyes and dirt under his fingernails. Mateo. I had no money. I had no plan. I had a powerful enemy who would likely try to stop me. But as I drifted off to sleep in that drafty little house on the east side, listening to the rhythm of the rain, I realized something. I was poor. I was homeless. But I was finally, truly rich. The morning light didn't filter through heavy velvet drapes today. It came in sharp and gray through Rosa's thin, yellowed lace curtains, hitting me squarely in the eyes. For a second, just a heartbeat, I didn't know where I was. I reached out for the 800 thread count Egyptian cotton sheets of my canopy bed, but my hand met the scratchy wool of the blanket. The smell wasn't the sterile scent of polished wood and fresh lilies that permeated the Sterling mansion. It was the smell of frying chorizo, strong coffee, and damp timber. I sat up, the springs of the old sofa groaning beneath me. My neck was stiff, my silk blouse was a wrinkled disaster, and my hair felt like a bird's nest. But as I looked around the cluttered living room, seeing the ceramic figurines on the mantelpiece and the family photos of people I didn't know, my chest didn't feel tight. The panic attack I usually woke up with, the pressure to be perfect, to be Richard's daughter, was gone. In its place was a terrifying, hollow ache. The ache of having lost everything, and the vertigo of having everything to gain. "Lucia," I whispered to myself, "you are Lucia Rossi." "Come eat, child." Rosa appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She looked tired, her eyes puffy, likely from crying over the letters I had shown her last night, or perhaps from worrying about the fugitive sleeping in her living room. I stood up, my legs wobbly. "I don't want to be a burden, Rosa. I need to go." "Sit," she ordered, pointing a wooden spoon at the small round table in the corner of the kitchen. "You are not going anywhere on an empty stomach. And you are not going anywhere looking like that. You look like a rich girl who got lost in a hurricane." I sat. The table was covered in a plastic tablecloth with a pattern of lemons. She placed a plate of eggs and chorizo in front of me and a mug of coffee so black it looked like oil. "I have no money, Rosa," I said, the shame burning my cheeks hot. I threw my phone away, my cards. I assume Richard has already cut them. He threatened to leave me with nothing. Rosa sat opposite me, wrapping her hands around her own mug. "He can take the money, Lucia, but he cannot take your hands. He cannot take your mind. My mother came to this country with $5 and a baby on her hip. We survived. You will survive." "But I need to get to Italy," I said, my voice cracking. I looked down at my hands. They were manicured, soft, useless hands. Hands that had never worked a day in their life. How do I get to Tuscany with $0? Rosa reached across the table and touched my wrist. She tapped the diamond tennis bracelet that glittered there, stark and offensive against the plastic tablecloth. "You are not as poor as you think," she said softly. I looked at the bracelet. It was a gift from Richard for my graduation. I remembered the night he gave it to me. He hadn't hugged me. He had simply slid the velvet box across the table and said, "Make sure you wear this to the gala. It reflects well on the family." It wasn't a gift. It was a shackle. I unclasped it. The diamonds caught the weak morning light. There is a pawn shop on 4th Street, Rosa said, her voice practical, devoid of pity. It is not a nice place, but they ask no questions. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I ate the eggs quickly, realizing I was starving. It was the first honest meal I had eaten in years. I'm going now, I said, standing up. Wait. Rosa went to a drawer and pulled out a pair of scissors and a box of hair dye. Dark brown, almost black. If you are going to be Lucia Rossi, she said, her eyes sad but firm, you cannot look like the sterling heiress. That blonde hair, it cost thousands of dollars to maintain, no? It screams money. It screams him. I touched my hair. Richard had insisted on the highlights. Blonde is more approachable, Lucia. It looks more American. Cut it, I said. Rosa sat me down on a kitchen chair. She draped a towel over my shoulders. I heard the snip of the scissors, and I watched a long lock of blonde hair fall to the linoleum floor. It lay there like a dead snake. Snip, snip. With every cut, I felt lighter. The heavy, styled layers that I had spent hours curling every morning were falling away. Rosa worked in silence, her breathing steady. When she was done, my hair brushed my shoulders. Then she applied the dye. The smell of ammonia filled the small kitchen, burning my nose, but I welcomed it. It was the smell of change. 40 minutes later, I stood in front of the small, cracked mirror in her hallway. The woman staring back at me was a stranger. Her hair was dark, framing her face in a way that made her eyes look larger, deeper. She looked Italian. She looked like the woman in the photograph I carried in my purse. She looked like Elena. I started to cry, silent tears that tracked through the cheap dye on my forehead. He can't see me anymore, I whispered. Richard, if he saw me now, he wouldn't recognize me. Good, Rosa said, handing me a heavy coat that smelled of mothballs. Put this on. Your silk coat will attract thieves. Go, do what you must. I will wait here. I walked out into the gray day. The rain had stopped, but the streets were full of puddles that reflected the overcast sky. I walked with my head down, clutching my purse against my chest. The neighborhood was waking up. I saw a woman pushing a stroller with a broken wheel. I saw a man sleeping on a bench, covered in newspapers. For 26 years, I had been driven past neighborhoods like this in a limousine with tinted windows. I had looked away. Now I was walking on the cracked pavement, one of them. The pawn shop had bars on the windows and a sign that said, "We buy gold," in peeling red letters. A bell chimed as I pushed the door open. Inside, it smelled of stale cigarette smoke and dust. A man with a thick beard and glasses sat behind a high counter, reading a magazine. He looked up, his eyes scanning me from my cheap shoes, Rosa's spare sneakers, to my dark hair, and finally resting on the silk blouse that peeked out from under the wool coat. "Help ya?" he grunted. I walked to the counter. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I had never done this. I felt like a criminal. I reached into my bag and pulled out the bracelet. I laid it on the glass counter. I need to sell this. The man picked it up. He pulled a jeweler's loop from his pocket and screwed it into his eye. He examined the diamonds in silence. The seconds stretched out, agonizing. "It's real," I said, my voice defensive. "It's a sterling." He dropped the loop and looked at me. "I don't care who made it. I care about the weight. 4 carats. Decent clarity." "How much?" I asked. 2,000. My jaw tightened. Richard had insured it for 15,000. "It's worth 5 times that," I said, trying to channel some of the business negotiation skills I had been forced to learn. The man shrugged, pushing the bracelet back towards me. "Then go to Christie's. Go to an auction house. Oh, wait, you can't, can you? That takes weeks. You are here because you need cash today, right now. He named my desperation perfectly. He saw right through me. 2,000, he repeated. Take it or leave it. I looked at the bracelet. It represented a dozen charity balls where I had to smile until my face hurt. It represented dinners where Richard corrected my posture in front of guests. It represented a lie. I reached into my bag again. I pulled out my diamond earrings. I pulled out the pearl necklace my grandmother, Sterling, had left me. I put them all on the pile. Take it all, I said, my voice shaking. Just give me enough to get to Italy and start a life. The man raised an eyebrow. He did some calculations on a greasy notepad. 5,000 for the lot. Cash, no paperwork. $5,000 for $250,000 worth of jewelry? It was robbery. It was insulting. I took a deep breath. Done. He counted out the bills. Old, worn $100 bills. He pushed the stack under the glass partition. I grabbed the money, shoving it deep into my purse. I didn't look back at the jewelry. I turned and walked out of the shop, the bell chiming behind me. I walked to the nearest travel agency, a small, hole-in-the-wall place 3 blocks down. I didn't have a phone to book online. I had to do this the old way. I need a ticket to Florence, I told the agent, a tired-looking woman with bright pink lipstick. One way. Leaving today. She typed on her keyboard. That's expensive, honey. Last minute. I don't care. I paid in cash. When she handed me the paper itinerary, my hands were trembling so hard I almost dropped it. Flight 294, departure 6 p.m. I was leaving. I was really leaving. I walked back to Rosa's house, the adrenaline beginning to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. But as I turned onto her street, I saw a black sedan parked in front of her house. My heart stopped. It was a Lincoln town car, tinted windows, the same model Richard's private security team used. He found me. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. I dove behind a parked van, peering around the bumper. 2 men in dark suits were standing on Rosa's porch. One of them was pounding on the door. "Open up!" I heard one of them shout. "We know she came here!" I watched as the blue door opened a crack. I couldn't hear what Rosa said, but I saw her finger wagging in their faces. She was fearless, but she was old, and she was alone. "Leave her alone!" I wanted to scream, but I clamped my hand over my mouth. If I went there, they would take me. They would drag me back to the mansion, lock me in my room, medicate me until I forgot my own name. Richard would win. One of the men pushed the door open forcefully, stepping inside. "No!" I gasped. I looked down at the ticket in my hand. I looked at the house. I had to choose. Save Rosa and lose myself, or run and save the truth. Then I saw Rosa. She was being pushed out onto the porch, but she wasn't crying. She was shouting. She pointed down the street, towards the bus stop in the opposite direction. She was lying to them. She was giving me a head start. She looked directly at the spot where I was hiding, though she couldn't possibly see me. Her eyes were fierce. "Go," her posture screamed. "Run." A sob tore from my throat. I turned and ran. I ran through the puddles, ruining Rosa's sneakers. I ran until my lungs burned and the black sedan was just a memory. I hailed a cab on the main boulevard, throwing myself into the back seat. "The airport," I wheezed. "Fast." The driver looked at me in the rearview mirror. A woman with bad hair dye, wearing an oversized wool coat, gasping for air, clutching a purse like it contained the crown jewels. "You in trouble, miss?" I looked out the window as the city blurred past, the city Richard Sterling owned, the city that was a monument to his lies. "No," I said, clutching the birth certificate inside my bag, feeling the outline of the key taped to the diary. I was in trouble. Now, I'm finally free. At the airport, I was invisible. Without the designer luggage, without the entourage, I was just another passenger in the economy line. I went through security, my heart in my throat, terrified that an alarm would sound, that Richard had put me on a no-fly list. But the light turned green. I walked through. I sat at the gate, watching the planes take off and land. I had $5,000 in my pocket and a name that felt like a prayer. Mateo. I opened the diary again. I turned to the last entry my mother had written, the ink shaky, as if she had been crying while she wrote. My darling Lucia, if you are reading this, I am gone, and I hope you are far away from here. Find him. Find the part of me I had to leave behind. Tell him I loved him until my last breath. And tell yourself. You were made from love, not a contract. Go home, my daughter. Go to the vines. I stood up. I didn't have a carry-on. I didn't have a plan for when I landed. I only had the address Rosa had given me. Il Cuore di Elena, San Gimignano. I walked down the jet bridge. I stepped onto the plane. And as the heavy door sealed shut behind me, sealing out the United States, sealing out Richard, sealing out the girl I used to be, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The engines roared to life. I closed my eyes and visualized the olive groves. I visualized a man with my eyes. I am coming, Papa, I thought. I am coming home.
El autobús traqueteaba por las carreteras serpenteantes de la Toscana, levantando una nube de polvo ocre que se pegaba a las ventanillas. No era una limusina con cristales tintados. No había aire acondicionado silencioso, solo el viento caliente y seco que entraba por las escotillas abiertas, oliendo a ciprés, a tierra quemada por el sol y a algo dulce, como fruta madura. Apreté mi bolso contra el pecho, sintiendo el latido de mi propio corazón golpear contra el cuero sintético. Cada kilómetro que me alejaba del aeropuerto de Florencia era un kilómetro más lejos de la jaula de oro de Richard Sterling, pero también un paso más hacia un abismo desconocido. Miré mis manos. Ya no llevaban el esmalte perfecto de hace 2 días. Las uñas estaban mordidas, la piel reseca. Me vi reflejada en el cristal sucio del autobús, el cabello oscuro y mal teñido, las ojeras profundas, la ropa arrugada. Por primera vez en mi vida, nadie me miraba. Para los granjeros y turistas en el autobús, yo era solo una mujer cansada, una mancha más en el paisaje. Y esa invisibilidad era el regalo más grande que había recibido. ¡San Gimignano!, gritó el conductor, frenando con un chirrido metálico que me hizo saltar en el asiento. Bajé con las piernas temblorosas. El sol de la tarde caía pesado sobre mis hombros, un calor físico y real que contrastaba con el frío perpetuo de la mansión en Nueva York. Saqué el papel arrugado donde Rosa había escrito la dirección. No había GPS, no había señal en el teléfono desechable que había comprado en el aeropuerto. Solo tenía mi instinto y la desesperación de una hija huérfana. Comencé a caminar. Mis pies, acostumbrados a tacones de diseñador y suelas italianas hechas a medida, dolían dentro de las zapatillas baratas de Rosa. Cada piedra del camino se clavaba en mi planta, recordándome que la penitencia es parte de la redención. Caminé durante casi 1 hora, alejándome de las torres medievales del pueblo, adentrándome en los caminos rurales, donde los olivos se extendían como ancianos retorcidos, ofreciendo sus brazos al cielo. La sed me secaba la garganta, pero no me detuve. Tenía miedo de que si paraba, el coraje que me había prestado mi madre desde la tumba se evaporara. Y entonces, tras una curva en el camino de tierra, lo vi. Un arco de madera vieja, desgastado por décadas de lluvia y sol. Y un cartel pintado a mano, con letras cursivas que se inclinaban con elegancia. Il cuore di Elena, el corazón de Elena. Mis rodillas cedieron, caí al suelo, levantando una nube de polvo, y sollocé.
No fue un llanto de tristeza, fue el sonido de 25 años de mentiras rompiéndose dentro de mi pecho. Él no la había olvidado.
Mientras Richard compraba silencio y estatus, mientras mi padre legal borraba cada rastro de mi madre de la casa, este hombre, este campesino al que llamaban Nadie, había bautizado su vida entera con el nombre de ella. La injusticia de todo aquello me golpeó con la fuerza de un huracán. Habían robado nuestro tiempo. Nos habían robado los domingos de pasta casera, las risas, las peleas, el amor sencillo. Nos habían robado la verdad para proteger una cuenta bancaria. Me sequé las lágrimas con la manga sucia de mi abrigo. Me puse de pie. No había venido hasta aquí para llorar en la entrada. Había venido para reclamar mi historia. Crucé el arco. El camino llevaba a una casa de piedra pequeña, modesta, con macetas de geranios rojos explotando de color en las ventanas. No había rejas de seguridad, no había cámaras, solo una bicicleta apoyada contra la pared y un perro viejo que levantó la cabeza, me miró con desinterés y volvió a dormirse. Y allí estaba él. Estaba de espaldas, agachado junto a una hilera de vides atando una rama con una cuerda de yute. Llevaba una camisa blanca arremangada, manchada de tierra, y un pantalón de trabajo gris. Su cabello era una mezcla de plata y negro, brillando bajo el sol. «Scusi». Mi voz salió como un susurro, un hilo de sonido que apenas perturbó el canto de las cigarras. El hombre se detuvo, su espalda se tensó. Se enderezó lentamente, limpiándose las manos en los pantalones, y se giró. El tiempo se detuvo. Literalmente sentí cómo el mundo dejaba de girar. Tenía mis ojos, no los ojos azules y fríos de los Sterling. Tenía mis ojos oscuros, profundos, con esa pequeña mancha dorada cerca de la pupila que yo siempre había odiado porque Richard decía que era un defecto. Su rostro estaba marcado por el sol y el trabajo duro, surcos de experiencia alrededor de la boca y en la frente, pero era un rostro amable. No había la dureza calculadora que yo había visto en los hombres toda mi vida. Me miró con curiosidad, entornando los ojos contra el sol. «Sí, ¿posso ayudarla, signorina?» Su voz era grave, rasposa, como piedra caliente. Traté de hablar, pero mi garganta estaba cerrada. Di un paso adelante. Mis manos temblaban tanto que tuve que apretarlas contra mis muslos. Él frunció el ceño, dando un pequeño paso hacia mí, preocupado por mi estado visiblemente lamentable. «¿Se encuentra bien?», preguntó de nuevo, esta vez en un inglés con un fuerte acento, al notar mi ropa extranjera y mi confusión. Yo... Busqué en mi bolso frenéticamente, mis dedos torpes tropezando con el diario, hasta que encontré la foto de él, joven, sonriendo en este mismo campo. Caminé hacia él como una sonámbula y le tendí la foto. Él la tomó con precaución, sus dedos rozando los míos. Sus manos eran callosas, ásperas como la corteza de un árbol, calientes. Bajó la vista hacia la imagen en blanco y negro. Vi cómo el color desaparecía de su rostro. Sus manos empezaron a temblar, arrugando ligeramente el borde de la fotografía. Levantó la vista hacia mí y esta vez realmente me miró. No miró mi ropa sucia ni mi pelo temido. Miró mi estructura ósea. Miró mi barbilla. Me miró a los ojos. Su boca se abrió ligeramente. Un jadeo de incredulidad escapando de sus labios. «¿Elena?», susurró, con una voz tan llena de dolor y esperanza que sentí que me partía en dos. Era el sonido de un hombre que ha esperado un fantasma durante media vida. Negué con la cabeza, las lágrimas corriendo libremente por mi cara, limpiando la suciedad del viaje. «No», dije, mi voz rompiéndose. «Soy Lucía, su hija». El mundo pareció inclinarse. Mateo dejó caer la foto. No le importó que cayera al polvo. Dio un paso vacilante hacia mí, como si temiera que yo fuera un espejismo provocado por el calor y la soledad. Extendió una mano, temblorosa, hacia mi rostro. Yo no me aparté, me incliné hacia su tacto. Cuando su palma áspera tocó mi mejilla, sentí una descarga eléctrica, una conexión biológica y espiritual que nunca había sentido con Richard Sterling. Richard me tocaba como si fuera una inversión valiosa. Mateo me tocaba como si fuera un milagro. Lucía. Pronunció mi nombre como si fuera una oración sagrada. Sus ojos se llenaron de lágrimas, desbordándose, surcando las arrugas de su cara. Dios mío, Lucía. Me dijeron que no existías, sollocé, dejando caer mi bolso, dejando caer mis defensas, dejando caer 26 años de armadura. Me dijeron que eras malo, que no me querías. Un rugido de dolor salió de su garganta, un sonido animal, y acortó la distancia entre nosotros. Me envolvió en sus brazos. Olía a sudor, a tierra, a tabaco y a lavanda. Era el olor más maravilloso del mundo. Me apretó contra su pecho con una fuerza desesperada, como si quisiera volver a juntar todas las piezas rotas de nuestras vidas. Mentiras, susurró contra mi pelo, besando mi cabeza una y otra vez. Todo mentiras. Te busqué, escribí cartas, me las devolvieron todas. Me dijeron que si me acercaba te harían daño, que Elena no quería verme. Ella te amó hasta el final, dije contra su pecho, empapando su camisa con mis lágrimas. Encontré su diario. Ella nunca dejó de amarte. Ella murió para salvarme. Mateo se separó un poco para mirarme a la cara, acunando mi rostro entre sus manos grandes y trabajadoras. Sus pulgares limpiaron mis lágrimas. Había tanta tristeza en sus ojos, pero también una luz nueva, una llama que se encendía después de décadas de oscuridad. «Eres igual a ella», dijo con voz ronca. «Tienes su fuego». «Y tengo tu barbilla», dije, riendo entre sollozos, una risa histérica y liberadora. Él sonrió, una sonrisa torcida y hermosa que reconocí de la foto. «Ven», dijo, pasando su brazo por mis hombros, sosteniendo mi peso porque mis piernas ya no podían más. «Ven a casa, filla mía». «Estás en casa». Me guió hacia la casa de piedra. Al entrar, no vi mármol frío ni obras de arte pretenciosas. Vi una cocina pequeña con una mesa de madera maciza, estanterías llenas de libros y botellas de vino. Vi una foto enmarcada en la repisa de la chimenea. Mi madre, joven y radiante, con una flor en el pelo. Era el único altar en esta casa. Me sentó en una silla de paja. Sacó pan, queso y aceitunas. Sirvió un vaso de agua fría. Me observó comer como si fuera lo más fascinante que había visto nunca. ¿Y él?, preguntó Mateo después de un rato, su voz endureciéndose. No tuvo que decir el nombre de Richard. Su presencia flotaba como una sombra lejana. «Se acabó», dije, partiendo un trozo de pan con mis manos. Un gesto simple que en la mansión Sterling habría sido considerado vulgar, pero aquí se sentía sagrado. Me escapé. Dejé el dinero, dejé el apellido, dejé todo. Probablemente me esté buscando, pero ya no soy Lucía Sterling. Mateo extendió su mano sobre la mesa y cubrió la mía. Su agarre era firme, protector. «Aquí no eres Sterling, aquí eres Rosie. Y aquí, en esta tierra, el dinero de ese hombre no vale nada. Aquí valen las manos y el corazón. Y yo tengo muchas de las dos cosas para defenderte». Miré alrededor de la pequeña cocina, donde la luz del atardecer entraba dorada y cálida, iluminando las partículas de polvo que bailaban en el aire. No tenía ni un centavo a mi nombre. Mis zapatos estaban rotos. No sabía hablar el idioma. Richard Sterling seguía siendo uno de los hombres más poderosos de Nueva York, capaz de aplastar empresas con una llamada. Pero mientras miraba a mi padre, a mi verdadero padre, sirviéndome más agua con una devoción que el dinero no podía comprar, me di cuenta de la gran ironía de mi vida. Richard había pasado 25 años construyendo un imperio para dejarme una herencia. Pero la verdadera herencia estaba aquí, en el olor a pan recién horneado, en la verdad cruda y dolorosa, en la libertad de no tener que fingir. Papá, dije, probando la palabra en mi lengua. Sabía dulce, sabía a verdad. Dime, Lucía. Enséñame, pedí, señalando la ventana hacia los viñedos que se extendían bajo el sol poniente. Enséñame a trabajar la tierra, enséñame a cultivar il cuore di Elena. Quiero que mis manos se parezcan a las tuyas. Quiero ganarme mi vida, no heredarla. Mateo asintió, sus ojos brillando con orgullo. Mañana, dijo suavemente, mañana empezamos. Las uvas no esperan a nadie y tenemos mucho tiempo perdido que recuperar. Esa noche, dormí en una cama pequeña en una habitación que olía a lavanda seca. No había sábanas de seda egipcia, solo algodón áspero y limpio. Dejé la ventana abierta y escuché los grillos, el viento en los olivos y, desde la habitación de al lado, el sonido de mi padre tarareando una vieja canción italiana, la misma canción que Rosa me había dicho que él le cantaba a mi madre. Por primera vez en 26 años, no tuve pesadillas. No soñé con etiquetas, ni con galas benéficas, ni con la voz fría de Richard corrigiendo mi postura. Soñé con raíces, profundas, retorcidas y fuertes, hundiéndose en la tierra, bebiendo la lluvia, imposibles de arrancar. Había vivido una mentira de diamantes y hielo. Pero al despertar, con el sol de la Toscana bañando mi cara y la voz de mi padre llamándome para el desayuno, supe que mi verdad, mi hermosa y pobre verdad, valía más que todo el oro de Nueva York. La llave de la caja de seguridad me había dado la verdad, pero este lugar me había dado la vida. Fin.